So now we're going to look at the geography and the political situation at the time of Christ's ministry. We'll start out with the geography, and then we'll talk about Roman rule just a little bit after that. So this is a more factual lecture rather than inspirational lecture, and we'll begin with the size and the location of Israel. This slide here shows the picture that's in your book of, I don't know why they put Israel right in the middle of the United States, probably just to show you how huge the United States is. By the way, do you know if you ask a group of students, maybe middle school age students, to draw the countries of the world, they will make the American students, United States students will make the United States all out of proportion. Like it makes the United States huge, like the biggest country, and we're nowhere near the biggest country. But obviously, Israel is among one of the smallest countries. It's only about 390 miles long, north to south, and about 30 to 80 miles from east to west. It's the size, roughly, of Massachusetts and Connecticut put together, which are two of our smallest states. But even though it is a tiny dot compared to the rest of the world, it is the center of the world. It has been from the beginning. This is what God said through the prophet Ezekiel. Thus says the Lord God, this is Jerusalem. I have set her in the center of the nations with countries all around her. And that is still true. You can see here is the world. You can see the United States. Can you see the little red line? Can you see that? You see that, guys? Little red line. That's Israel. That's Israel. And yet it is the Holy Land. It is the land that God gave to the Israelites. And they were and still are surrounded by nations, most of whom are their enemies. There you see a little bit of a close-up. You can see, compared to the Sinai Peninsula, how small it is. And then, as now, they were surrounded by large countries, large empires in Jesus' day, or before Jesus' day, Old Testament time. And they were their enemies, including Assyria and Babylon and Asia Minor, which is now called Turkey, and Egypt. And today they are still surrounded by enemies. And it is a crossroads of the world even today. Israel is strategically and I believe divinely located so that it could make the greatest impact on the ancient world. Kings, warriors, merchants, the public, almost from anywhere in the ancient world would go through Israel. If you were going from Egypt up anywhere north, you were going to go through Israel. If you were going from Babylon to Egypt, same thing. Assyria, Asia Minor. If they traveled south, they were going through Israel. And so it did have a great impact on the world. Here's what Deuteronomy 7:6 says. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of this earth. So Deuteronomy is telling us that not only is it God's land, but they are God's people, and he placed them there. He placed his treasured people there. To apply this a little bit, it is not unlike our own lives. God has placed you in a family, in a school, in a church, in a youth group. And it's not an accident. He has put you in these places that you might have an impact on the people around you. just as ancient Israel and Israel today is supposed to have an impact on the people around. In fact, Peter 2:9 says basically the same thing as Deuteronomy. But you are a chosen race. So this is being written to Christians, right? Written by Peter, the Apostle Peter. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may complain. It's not why he made you this. That you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. He has placed you where you are, in your home, in your school, in your church, so that you might proclaim Christ, so that others might know God. And so each of us, it has been put where we can have an impact on others for Jesus. Now let's get back to the geography. We're going to talk about some of the physical features of Palestine, of Israel. We won't get through this today. We'll finish it on Monday. But it has a very varied climate in almost every conceivable way. You might not think of Israel having snow, but it does. In the north, in the mountains, it gets snow. Even in Jerusalem, Jerusalem gets snow. So God blessed this tiny little country with every imaginable climate, from the snowy slopes of Mount Hermon, some 9,000 feet above sea level, to the tropical Dead Sea region, where people go to get a suntan. In less than 5 hours, north to south, you can go from skiing on Mount Hermon to basking in the sun at the Dead Sea. You don't want to really swim, probably, but certainly you don't want to stay in for very long, and don't drink the water. But you can get a very warm climate there. So Israel's very, yes.
So do people swim in the Dead Sea? Like, can you do that?
They will go in it, but it's really it's so buoyant that it's hard. You need to float in some sense to like swim, right? But you really it's very hard to do. You can kind of just sit in the water and sit there, and not sink. So yeah, it is hard to swim in. It's possible, but it's hard. You certainly don't want to put your face down in there. That's because it leaves all salt all over your body. So in fact, every climate, pretty much every climate that can be found in the habitable world, is found within the borders of this tiny nation, which is really crazy. Within its borders, this tiny land, the Mediterranean Sea and 3,000-foot mountains are only a couple of miles apart. And there's beautiful, lush green valleys and dotted with shrubs and trees, and that's about 2 hours away from a barren desert. So you've got, this looks like Florida, right? And this looks like Haiti or something, right? But you go not too far away from that, and this is what you see. I mean, we'd have to get on an airplane to go look, or the zoo, to go see something like that. But you can see both of those views in Israel. And within 200 miles of each other are Mount Hermon, over 9,000 feet high above sea level, and the lowest point on the face of the earth, 1,300 feet below sea level, is the Dead Sea. By the way, do you know what the lowest point is in the United States?
Is it in Nebraska?
No, it's in California.
Oh.
Death Valley. It's called Death Valley. So the Dead Sea is 1,300 square feet. That's so funny. I'm looking at houses. 1,300 feet below sea level. Death Valley is only 280 feet below sea level. That's the lowest place in the United States. So that gives you an idea of just how low that elevation is. And then there are varied, so that's the varied geography. Here's more lush things, right? And here's, you go from this to this in a very short period of time. That's the shores of the Dead Sea. You can see all the salt on the rocks there, crusting the rocks. What? No, because it isn't NaCl. It's not sodium chloride. There are other kinds of salts and bromide salts, which are not. They are toxic. So you don't want to like grab it and go put it on your food, unless of course you sleep for. But then they also have very varied crops. These are bananas. By the way, when I first saw bananas growing in Zambia, I was like, they grow opposite to what I thought they would. Isn't that weird? I mean, I thought they would grow the other direction, but they don't. They don't. They grow. I guess it's the stem, but it just surprised me. And so they've got these crops that are growing on the coastal plains. They're called the Plains of Sharon. That's where Jaffa oranges come from. I don't know if you've ever heard of Jaffa oranges, but they're the most famous, delicious oranges in the world. And in Galilee, where Jesus grew up, you can grow grapes and cucumbers and olives and pretty much any kind of vegetable. And then they also have, so here's grapes. I'll come back to that. Here's pomegranates. I don't know if you've ever had pomegranates. You don't actually eat the pomegranate, you eat the seeds. They're delicious, but it's a lot of hard work. So God told through Moses, God told his people what he was sending them into. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs, flowing out of the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you can dig copper. And you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. And that is a very apt description of Israel. So again, we see these pomegranates that are mentioned in Deuteronomy. So nowhere else. Here's from Deuteronomy 11. But the land that you are going over to possess is a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water by the rain from heaven, a land that the Lord your God cares for. The eyes of the Lord your God are always upon it, and from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. So nowhere else can you find such a variety of food grown in such a small area. And Deuteronomy tells us that God's eyes are on this land. It was designed this way by God, that it would be ultimately the place where the Messiah would live and die for mankind. So even the geography of the land of Israel was so created so that history would revolve around it. The most important historical events took place in Israel, the death and resurrection of Jesus. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the politics of Jesus' day. As you know, I'm sure, Palestine, Israel, was controlled by the Romans. Much of the known world was controlled by the Romans, right? And so you can look at the map on page 270 and 71, kind of keep your finger or your pen in the lecture notes, but then look back at pages 270 and 71 and you'll see these things. So as far as Israel was concerned, in Jesus' day, Israel was divided into three main areas. You had Judea to the south, and that's where Jerusalem was, so you see this right here. Then you had Samaria in the middle. And then you had Galilee up north by Lake Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee. And so you had Jews living in Judea and in Galilee, but you had the Samaritans living in the middle. We will talk about how the Samaritans came to be. For now, just know that the Jews hated the Samaritans and the Samaritans hated the Jews. Not unlike Israelis and Arabs today. They did not like each other, and we'll talk about why. So those are as far as Israel is concerned, those were the three major areas. However, it was controlled by Rome, which had a different way of dividing that area. It was divided into different, how many was it? Roman provinces. I think 4 or 5 Roman provinces. 1, 2 provinces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. And so the first one was Judea and Samaria. So they took Judea and Samaria and made that one Roman province. And during Christ's time, 7 different men ruled this area. And it's an area of hills and valleys. It has good grazing for flocks. And the city of Jerusalem, of course, was in that area, and obviously the focal point, the capital of that province, and really of the whole area. And then they put together Galilee and Perea. This top blue one is Galilee. On the other side of the Jordan, the Trans-Jordan, you see Perea. And Jesus visited those places. Obviously, he visited Galilee a lot, but Jesus visited Perea, some cities in Perea, and also in another place where we're going to talk about in a bit. And Herod Antipas, who you might remember from history, ruled this area. This area has to the north Mount Hermon, and so it gets a lot of snow runoff. In fact, about 25 inches of melting snow runoff, and so it is quite a good place for some crops, but it's also heavily wooded in places. And then in northern Galilee were Iturea and Trachonitis. Now, as you can see, these are, obviously boundaries, and that is just a circle. It's not because the actual province was a circle. It's because a lot of the people in that area were nomads, and nomads are people that move from place to place. They don't really have a land. They just have this area that they move around in. And so that is the area that those nomads moved around in. Because it's hard to tell precisely where their land was. And then the last one was Decapolis. Decapolis was 10 kind of loosely united or loosely in affiliation with one another. And it was not officially a Roman province. They had some autonomy. They didn't have complete autonomy, but they did have limited autonomy. Part of the way we know that is that coins have been found from cities in Decapolis, and the coin does not have Caesar's picture on it. It's the coinage is from those cities, and so that's shows a little bit of autonomous independence from Rome. So Decapolis, what does deca mean? Anyone know what deca means? How long is a decade? 10. Okay, so 10. And politics, right, means city. And so 10 cities. That's why it's called Decapolis. And again, not officially a Roman province, but Roman influence for sure. So this is the cutaway from the book. You can go back now, and if you want to look at that cutaway, you can. Remember that we're going west to east. We're from south looking at a cutaway of Israel. So you've got the Mediterranean in the west, and you've got the Transjordan on the east, the Transjordan hills on the east. And we're going to go through this cutaway. We talked about it a little bit yesterday as well, so we'll do it pretty quickly. But there are these 5 distinct geographical areas in Israel. The first one is the coastal plain. And it runs from the Mediterranean to the Mount Carmel, anywhere from 6 miles to 20 miles wide. Anybody know the significance of Mount Carmel in the Old Testament?
Isn't it Elijah?
Yeah. Elijah asked, he's a prophet, and he asked the prophets of Baal, he challenged them to a duel, if you will. And they each were to make a sacrifice and see whose God would actually accept the sacrifice. And so Elijah just kind of kicked back and watched while these guys, made their sacrifice and prayed to their God and started dancing to their God and started jumping around and singing and getting louder, and nothing happened. And all the while, Elijah was trash talking them. You don't think there's trash talking in the Bible, but basically he says, maybe your God's in the bathroom. Maybe he's busy in the bathroom right now and he can't hear you. But then Elijah not only put the sacrifice on, he poured water over it. Not only did he pour water over it, he built a trench around it, and that was overflowing with water, and God came down and annihilated the whole thing in a cloud of smoke. So he won that battle on Mount Carmel. God always wins his battles. So the coastal plain is very fertile. It's very good for growing things. It's the richest soil really in the world, and it's a fertile farmland for farming crops. And in Palestine, it's the most desirable land. It's the most prized and probably the most expensive real estate in Israel. And then we come to the Shephelah. So this has rich soil. The coastal plain has rich soil. Then we come to the Shephelah, which is rolling hills. Looks very much like any rolling hills in the United States. When I was in college, I went to visit a high school friend that I had known in Brussels because I was in D.C. To visit, to go see my sister. And so I got a car and drove down to southern Virginia and through these beautiful wooded rolling hills, just gorgeous wooded. Phil, you okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Rolling hills, and it's also very full of history. You've got Civil War battlefields, Revolutionary War battlefields everywhere in Virginia. It looks something like that. Those rolling hills, and it's also a good place for farming. You can grow grapes and olives and grain there, but it's also good for pastoral farming, which is farming animals, sheep, goats, llamas, cows, that sort of thing. Good place for that. Now, here's the thing. The Shephelah was a buffer zone. Because and I'm about to tell you this, most of Israel's cities and most of Israel's people lived in the Cisjordan Hills, in Jerusalem and in Judea and in Galilee. And the Philistines, remember back to the Old Testament, lived on the coastal plains. And so that Shephelah, those rolling hills, kind of kept the Philistines at bay at different times. It was then and is now a disputed area. And then you have the Cisjordan Hills, where most of Israel's cities are and where most of Israel's population lives. And these hills are very commonly associated with Israel's history. So remember that most of the cities and people are located there, and many battles have taken place there. Many historical stories have taken place there. The hills range from about 1,500 to 3,000 feet high, but as you go north, they grow in elevation till you get to the very northern part, which is now Lebanon, where Mount Hermon is. I don't know if Mount Hermon's in Israel or Lebanon, but the Lebanon mountains north of Galilee that continue to grow in height. And then we have the Jordan Valley. The Jordan Valley is actually part of a huge continental rift, a fault that runs for about 4,000 miles. and we'll talk about that on Monday. And then you have the Transjordan Hills, that Continental Rift, and then Transjordan Hills on the other side of the Jordan. And so, as the name implies, those hills lie on the other side, the east, across, trans means across, the Jordan River. And this area is basically a high plateau that rises gradually from the north. And this is what's called the East Bank area, which is has also been disputed at times. And it goes from the north to the south, actually growing in elevation in the south. So we're going to stop there for today. We'll talk about Israel's cities on Monday, and we'll talk about that rift in the Jordan Valley. You can, yeah.